Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining me today because we are looking at a truly lightning-in-a-bottle cultural phenomenon. We're going to explore the unique confluence of government policies, shifting demographics, and just raw cultural energy that birthed the massive 1990s Canadian rock explosion. So grab a seat, because this is a fascinating story of how an entire nation effectively engineered its very own cultural golden age, proving once and for all that, bureaucracy and rock and roll can actually mix.
Okay, let's dive into this. How exactly did a country, one that was famously known for losing its top-tier musicians, manage to engineer a massive, homegrown rock explosion that changed its cultural landscape forever? For decades, Canada was essentially just a farm team for the American music industry, but suddenly, the script flipped completely.
Here is our roadmap for today. 1. Before the Can rock explosion. 2. Engineering a music industry. 3. The 1990s Can rock golden age. 4. Defining Canadian rock identity. And finally, 5. The legacy of 90s Can rock. All right, let's start with section 1, before the Can rock explosion. To truly appreciate this incredible boom in the 90s, you kind of have to understand the literal dark ages of Canadian music that came right before it. If you were a talented Canadian musician in the 1960s or early 70s, you basically had one single career path if you wanted to make it big. Pack your bags and move to the United States. Incredible talents like Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, and Paul Anka literally had to flee south to find fortune and radio play, simply because the domestic industry just didn't exist to support them. But a rapid shift in national pride completely changed that trajectory. In 1965, Canada gets its own distinct flag. Then, by 1967, the country turns 100 years old and brings the whole world to Montreal for Expo 67. This massive World's Fair ignited a brand new sense of nationalism. And that wave of national pride didn't just stop at politics. It swept right through the cultural industries, culminating in a major regulatory shift in 1971.
That brings us to section 2, engineering a music industry.
Now, what's really interesting about this is, government regulations usually sounds like a pretty dry topic, right? But I promise you, what happened here wasn't just a set of boring laws. This was an aggressive and honestly incredibly successful industrial strategy of cultural protectionism designed to build a scene entirely from the ground up. The sheer force of this regulation was staggering. The Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission introduced CanCon, or Canadian Content Rules, in 1971. Literally overnight, all radio stations were required by law to devote 30% of their music airplay to Canadian artists. Because there was suddenly this legal quota to fill, an entire industry of recording studios, managers, promoters, and distribution networks had to be built just to feed the beast. They were effectively forcing a domestic music scene into existence. This infrastructure formed what you could call the holy trinity of the Can rock boom. First, you had CanCon, mandating the radio play. Then, in 1982, you had Factor, which was a fabulously successful foundation that poured money into emerging talent so they could actually afford recording and touring. Finally, in 1984, we get the launch of Much Music, often referred to as Canada's MTV. Much Music then created VideoFact, which funded the actual creation of the music videos themselves. Together, this trio of funding, radio, and national television worked in perfect harmony to juice the supply of high-quality, homegrown music. Moving right along to Section 3, the 1990s Can rock golden age. So, the soil was tilled, the seeds were planted in the 70s and 80s, and this is where our story hits its climax, and that industrial, long game finally blooms. The timing was absolutely perfect, because right as this infrastructure was peaking, a brand new demographic was coming of age, Generation X. For decades, there was this deeply ingrained anti-Canadian bias among listeners, basically this idea that if it was Canadian, it just couldn't be good unless the Americans approved it first. But Gen X, they didn't carry that baggage at all. They didn't care if a band was from Seattle or Saskatchewan. If the song jammed on Much Music, they made it their own. They grew up watching incredible domestic bands on television and hearing them in heavy rotation on FM radio. To them, it wasn't uncool to like local bands. They eagerly embraced it. And just listen to this massive roster of iconic bands that broke through during this era. We are talking about the Tragically Hip, Our Lady Peace, Sloan, the Matthew Good Band, Big Wreck, Spirit of the West, The Lowest of the Low, and the list just goes on and on. The scene completely exploded with variety. You had everything from heavy, introspective rock to maritime folk rock to pure, driving alt rock. It was a sheer scale of domestic talent that the country had literally never seen before. But how exactly did these bands connect so deeply with their fans? Well, it was essentially a three-step formula. First up, relentless touring in local bars and universities. These bands were incredibly accessible. They played in cities large and small all across the country. Second, they were in heavy rotation on Much Music, which gave fans a visual and personal connection through constant interviews. And third, the era gave rise to massive summer festivals. We're talking about legendary events like Edgefest and another roadside attraction, where 35,000 screaming fans would show up to an all-Canadian lineup. It forged an incredibly dedicated, tight-knit community.
Next up is Section 4, Defining Canadian Rock Identity. And this brilliantly illustrates just how drastic the cultural shift really was. What's so amazing about this era is that these bands weren't just trying to copy American grunge from Seattle or Britpop from the UK. They were actively forging a highly successful, unapologetic, and distinctly Canadian musical identity. On one hand, you had that old pre-90s mentality, waiting around for international validation before showing any support at home. But on the other hand, you had this new 90s mentality, fiercely supported by Much Music, fueled by local pride, and celebrating a distinctly Canadian style that mixed heavy guitars with introspective and sometimes very regionally specific lyrics.
Nowhere is this better highlighted than with the Tragically hip. Listen to this quote regarding their landmark 1992 album Fully Completely. It functioned as an important platform that actually challenged national mythology. Gord Downie, the band's brilliant frontman, wrote these cynical, angry, yet incredibly poetic takes on Canadian history and politics. The music absolutely didn't shy away from being distinctly Canadian, and academics have even argued the album challenged traditional concepts of masculinity and heteronormativity in rock. It was art that was both massively commercially successful and deeply thought-provoking. And this identity wasn't just centralized in Toronto either. We also saw some incredible regional success stories, most notably the Halifax pop explosion. Bands like Sloan burst onto the scene with such a distinct style of songwriting and performance that Halifax became internationally recognized. Sub Pop, the legendary Seattle label, even started signing bands from there. The media literally dubbed Halifax as Canada's answer to the Seattle grunge scene, proving for sure that local, isolated infrastructure could create world-class sounds.
Finally, Section 5, The Legacy of 90s Can Rock. Like all golden ages, this highly localized, rock-dominated era eventually began to wane. But as we're going to see, the foundation it built yielded a massive, long-term global payoff. When you ask the community what happened to this localized scene, you hear sentiments exactly like this quote from a fan on a music forum. "I think the internet killed everything. Much music died when Rogers took it over. Rock lost its central position." And honestly, it's true. The digital age and streaming totally fragmented listening habits. Much Music pivoted heavily to reality television, completely removing that centralized national campfire where fans used to discover new bands. On top of that, the rising costs of touring just decimated local venues, making the relentless university circuits of the 90s incredibly difficult to sustain today.
So the crucial point is, the system didn't fail. Actually, scratch that. It succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. By the late 90s, the infrastructure built by CanCon and Factor wasn't just supporting indie rock. It had catapulted Canadian artists to sheer global domination. 40 million, that is the number of copies Shania Twain's Come On Over sold worldwide, making it one of the best-selling albums of all time. Add to that Alanis Morissette's 35 million for Jagged Little Pill and Celine Dion's selling over 30 million per record. The industrial long game worked. It built the launchpad that makes Canada a global music superpower to this very day. But this leaves us with a truly fascinating thought to end our explainer on today. In today's digital, borderless streaming world, where algorithms have essentially replaced Much Music and anyone can upload a song globally in a matter of seconds, could a country ever replicate the highly localized, incredibly tight-knit magic of the 90s can rock era? Was this just an unrepeatable intersection of government policy and cultural hunger? Let that sink in next time you put on your favorite 90s rock playlist. Thanks so much for joining me today, and keep exploring.